Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. Today is a Comprehensivist Wednesday, and it's delightful to have CJ back. And he's going to be talking about Dante and comprehensivism. I'm really, really eager to hear this. We do Comprehensivist Wednesdays in collaboration with the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. So welcome, everybody from Philadelphia and all over the US and world. Over to you, CJ.
Welcome to Comprehensivist Wednesdays, an ongoing series of weekly events designed to foster the art of comprehensivity, our inclination to comprehensively integrate all humanity's sources of learning, all humanity's traditions of inquiry and action, and all humanity's experiences, so as to better comprehend the world and how it works. Buckminster Fuller called it being adequately macro-comprehensive and micro-incisive. No one can fully integrate all humanity's traditions and experiences. However, it is my conviction that the attempt can open new worlds of learning that may not be possible through other approaches. Tonight, there will be 2 segments with interactive discussion after each. If any of you are new, that means you will be asked during the interactive sessions to contribute questions or thoughts about our topic. This is an interactive forum. Let's get started. The topic is Dante's Comedìa and our comprehensivity. Our comprehensivity is our facility for comprehensive thinking and action. One way to build our understanding of comprehensive practice is to look for precursors in historical works. Tonight, we will examine the comprehensive ideas used by Dante Aligheri, born in 1265, died in 1321. In his great works, La Vita Nuova and the Comedìa, which is more commonly known as the Divine Comedy, even though Dante never used that title. Since January, the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society and 52 Living Ideas have organized group explorations of Dante's greatest works to commemorate the septicentennial of his death 7 centuries ago. Tonight's event will survey ideas for deepening our understanding of the practice, values, and history of comprehensive inquiry and action, which might be highlighted by exploring Dante's great works. In 1320, the year before he died, Dante completed his magnum opus, the Comedìa, which consists of 3 parts: Inferno, or hell, Purgatorio, or purgatory, and Paradiso, paradise. Even if you are unfamiliar with Dante's work, you should be able to follow much of the discussion, and you might be able to raise excellent questions, which we would welcome. This first segment, I'm going to look at the virtues of comprehensivity in the Comedìa. All traditions of inquiry and action are characterized by the values which guide its practice. These values can be called the epistemic virtues for that system of learning and doing. In previous events, we have identified 10 epistemic virtues for comprehensive exploration. Let's examine Dante's Comedìa to see to what extent it embraces each of these values. First, adequate breadth. Adequate breadth is the aspiration to engage and accommodate a sufficiently large and diverse collection of other traditions in our explorations. In Buckminster Fuller's terms, this aspiration is the injunction to begin all our explorations with universe, which he defined as all humanity's consciously apprehended and communicated experience. Breadth is pervasive throughout the Commedia. Inferno is a broad exploration of bad actions or sins. Purgatorio is a broad exploration of virtues and vices, good and bad motivations. Paradiso is a broad exploration of the intellectual principles believed to make the world work. Another breadth found in the Commedia is the range of prior literature that Dante references, from the Odyssey to Virgil's Aeneid, Ovid's Metamorphoses, Aristotle, Cicero, Augustine's City of God and his Confessions, Ibn Rushd, also known as Averroes in the West, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. In the Bible, I particularly noted the Song of Songs, Book of Psalms, Gospel of Matthew, and Book of Revelation. But there's much more, both the Bible and other sources. These literary references and the cultural figures they evoke is immense. It is epic. The Commedia surveys some 2 millennia of prior literature. The Commedia is continually negotiating the boundaries of the breadth of acceptable human knowing and doing. One of its far-reaching images for unacceptable transgression of knowledge is given by Ulysses in Inferno 26. Nothing could quench deep in myself the burning wish to know the world and have experience of all men's vices, of all human worth. In lecture 8 of his course on Dante, Giuseppe Mazzotta says, quote, Dante implies and seems to agree with, if one were to read the trajectory of the Divine Comedy, that there is no knowledge worthy of its name unless it is connected to some degree of transgression, that somehow transgression is part of knowing, end quote. I wonder, perhaps Dante's exploration of the transgression of knowledge is the Commedia's way to gloss the importance of an adequate breadth. Transgression may be seen as the attempt to be all-knowing, which is humanly impossible. Comprehensive exploration instead requires an adequate breadth. Our second epistemic virtue is adequate depth. This is the aspiration to comprehend each subject explored in as much detail as is judged reasonable. The evocative, poetic voice of the Commedia can produce substantial depth with might seem a paucity of words. For example, in Inferno 4, Dante writes, Averroes, who made the commentary. This indirectly reminds us of the translation movement of the 12th century, where Aristotle's teachings were reacquired from the Islamic world and then became very influential in the 13th century with the work of Albertus Magnus and Thomas Aquinas and many others. Intertextual, intercultural references like these open a world of depth with just one phrase of poetry. The Commedia also achieves depth by repeatedly exploring topics. The theme of justice is perhaps the most deeply explored subject in the Commedia, as Dante keeps addressing it in canto after canto, passage after passage. Other deeply explored subjects include the nature and role of language, especially poetry, the cultural history of Italy, the integration of Aristotle's thinking with Christianity, the body, the importance of learning and understanding of love and desire, the role of the Greek and Roman traditions in medieval Christianity, and much more. Our third epistemic virtue of comprehensive learning is empiricism. This is the aspiration to both infer hypotheses and to assess them from the concrete evidence in humanity's inventory of experience in the universe as defined by Buckminster Fuller. The most prominent and intensive example of empirical thinking in the Comedìa occurs in Paradiso 2, where Beatrice describes a battery of experiments and arguments to test hypotheses and draw conclusions to explain the modeled appearance of the moon. The text includes 2 lines that clearly value empiricism. By experiment, the source which fills the rivers of man's art. The fourth epistemic virtue for our comprehensive learning, multiple working hypotheses or multiple perspectives. This is the recognition that there are multiple perspectives from which to consider a subject and multiple hypotheses that may help us understand it. Therefore, comprehensive inquiry and action aspires to identify and consider sufficient numbers of perspectives and hypotheses to adequately inform our analytical, synthetic, and integrative imaginations. In Paradiso 2, 2 hypotheses are explored. In Paradiso 8, the interchange with Charles Martel, Dante learns, quote, the very roots of man's activities must be diverse. The poem goes on to explain in a complex name qualities periphrasis that society needs at least the talents and perspectives of lawyers, warriors, priests, and artisans. Further evidence for multiple perspectives can be found in the Heaven of the Sun, where Dante meets 24 diverse scholars, some of whom strongly disagreed with each other in life. In the next passage I'll read from Paradiso 13, Dante emphasizes the importance of making distinctions to clarify one's thinking so that we can judge better. Such distinctions can be seen as an elementary form of perspective or an alternative hypothesis. Let this be leaden weight upon your feet to make you move slow as a weary man, both to the yes or no you do not see. For he ranks low indeed among the fools who rushes to affirm or deny, no matter which, without distinguishing. In addition, the poet's art of juxtaposition causes the Comedìa to reverberate with thoughts engaging multiple perspectives and hypotheses throughout. This is one of Dante's strongest epistemic virtues for comprehensive thinking. It is probably why the poem resonates so much for so many readers. Now, the fifth epistemic virtue I have for comprehensive learning is an adequate wholeness for meaning making. This is the recognition that the meaning making process involves the dynamics of Gestalt shifts and Gestalt crystallizations that bring into focus identified complexes of interdefined resonant relations that form significant wholes. Jan's wiki highlights this idea as the experience of meaning. Dante, it seems to me, has one glimpse of the experience of meaning in this metaphor from Purgatorio 7. As one who suddenly beholds a thing incredible will first believe and then misdoubt and say, it is, it cannot be. This is a wonderful insight, but it blurs doubts and hesitations with what I call mistake mystique following Buckminster Fuller. And it fails to see Gestalt learning as the art of meaning making. Okay, we're about halfway through my list, and in fear that people might be losing the big picture, I'm going to make a mistake. That's what I'm going to do. Okay, what do I have to do here?
You click on the share screen, the green button.
The problem is I forgot to maximize my image.
It's all right. I have put all of them in the chat again.
F11. Okay. This is not hard. I am an internaut. Okay, Shrikant, could you ask me to share my video?
Yes. Your video is working. Go ahead.
Oh, it is?
Yes.
Excellent. Now. Okay. For the sixth epistemic virtue for comprehensive learning, mistake mystique. This is the realization that there will always be inherent gaps in our understanding, communication, and in our desired outcomes in our designs. Mistake mystique is the aspiration to identify and further minimize these gaps through iterative, comprehensive exploration. Formulating good questions can help us identify and negotiate these gaps. But the evidence from the 13th century is that mistake making was strongly and negatively sanctioned. One example I found was in Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's commentary on Inferno 15, where Dante meets his former teacher. Quote from Longfellow: "This Ser Brunetto Latini was a Florentine and a very able man in some of the liberal arts and in philosophy. But his principal calling was that of notary, and he held himself and his calling in such great esteem that having made a mistake in a contract drawn up by him, and having been in consequence accused of fraud, he preferred to be condemned for it rather than to confess that he had made a mistake." In Purgatorio 3, after Cato confronts the penitent for gathering around Casella, negligently singing one of Dante's canzone, which is a type of poetic song, Dante muses, "O dignity of conscience, noble, chaste, how one slight fault can sting you with shame." Both these examples, the Longfellow quote and this quote from Purgatorio 3, suggests that mistakes are very negatively sanctioned. As a result, I feel I found no real sense of mistake mystique as an epistemic virtue in the Comedìa. Now, the idea of the purgation of sin in Purgatorio provides a kind of ritualized response to sin, to mistake making. But the Comedìa is, in my view, downright cruel and inhuman when it comes to sin. Dante's notion of sin often leads to a violent self-flagellation, as on the Terrace of Pride, where we learn in Purgatorio 10 that souls carry as punishments weights on their backs, compressing them, in the most severe cases, quote, with chest pressed tightly down against its knees. So Dante considers mistakes and their ritual atonement, but his treatment is horrific, tortuously inhumane, and anything but the kind of mistake mystique that is both healthy and necessary for effective, comprehensive inquiry and action. However, there is a little gesture toward valuing mistakes in the comical passage near the end of Paradiso 28, where Gregory the Great laughs at his mistake in ranking the angels. And there's a tantalizing but ambiguous verse in Purgatorio 15 after the ecstatic vision near the beginning of the Terrace of Wrath, which may evoke some sentiment of mistake mystique. Quote, "I came to know my errors were not false." Throughout the poem, the pilgrim asks questions expressing his doubts. While these might indicate mistake mystique, the assumption seems to me to always be that a guide will explain and the pilgrim will learn the truth. Sometimes these explanations include ambiguities, but the poem, it seems to me, seems to believe that there's always a right answer and the doubts just require some instruction. And sometimes that does involve learning the limits of human knowing, but not, as I see it, mistake mystique. Even considering these approximations to mistake mystique, I feel Dante has no real mystique about mistakes, no positive, heightened value or interest in mistake making. Maybe mistake mystique is a modern value. We might not find it articulated in older literature. Generalized principles is the next one. Generalized principles are the aspiration to refine the meaningful wholes we identify through consideration of the gaps seen by our mistake mystique into principles that abstract and accommodate vast subsets of humanity's accumulated inventory of experiences. As such, generalized principles are one of the most important qualities of our learning. Even though Dante seems to have no awareness of the crucial intermediate processes of forming wholes in meaning making, nor in negotiating the inherent gaps with mistake mystique, following ancient traditions, he succeeds in identifying generalized principles. In this passage from Purgatorio 15, where am I? Right. In this passage from Purgatorio 15, Dante summarizes the generalized principle or theory of reflection, which was developed by and experimentally validated by Ibn al-Haytham. A ray leaps back from water or from glass, reflecting back the other way as it ascends the same way it first came down, forming an angle with the plummet line exactly equal to the incidence, as theory and experiment both show. The idea that theory and experiment must agree was emphasized by Ibn al-Haytham in the early 1000s. It is an emphatic formulation of the value of empiricism, which is a very effective but more elementary approach than mistake-mystique. There are several more examples I would highlight of generalized principles in Paradiso. In Canto 1 of Paradiso, Beatrice answers Dante's question, "How can I rise through these light bodies here?" Answers with a general explanation of how the universe operates. Quote, "The providence that regulates the whole." So as previously mentioned, Beatrice, and then in Canto 2, Beatrice explains the variegated appearance of the moon. The formal principle of different virtues mingle differently. I take that as a generalized principle. In Canto 7, Beatrice explains the complex theological doctrine, how just vengeance can justly be avenged, which is how the questions posed in Canto 7. Each step of her argument is an asserted generalized principle, since all arguments are composed of generalized principles. Okay. I want to look next at integrity as epistemic virtue for comprehensive learning. Integrity I define as the aspiration to accommodate and account for each experience, perspective, hypothesis, idea, and generalized principle relevant to our inquiry and/or action as an all-encompassing coherent whole or schema. That is the aspiration to integrate our comprehensive exploration into a comprehensively integral whole, into an integrity. One of the themes in Paradiso is how Dante's doubts and his desire to understand are addressed by Beatrice and the other splendors. One of the clearest instances of this is after Beatrice explains the difference between conditional and absolute will in Paradiso 4. Such was the flowing of the holy stream that pours down from the fountain of all truth, that it now laid both of my doubts to rest. Beatrice's words are the flowing of the holy stream, and I take God as the fountain of all truth. But this is received wisdom. It's not the kind of human-wrought effort to puzzle out sometimes contradictory ideas into an interaccommodative, comprehensive integrity. Nevertheless, we can see that Dante is showing this epistemic virtue of integrity. It's clearly there, even if it usually takes the form of received wisdom. I've talked in some previous events about thoroughly refined ignorance, and I'm defining it now as the epistemic virtue of comprehensive comprehension. It is the aspiration to structure all our learning, for example, from the previous 8 epistemic virtues, with a fabric of questions. So the fabric of questions is key. These questions systematically interrogate the gaps that are identified by our mistake mystique, to situate all of our experiences, perspectives, hypotheses, ideas, generalized principles, and integrities in our thoroughly refined ignorance, which may be our ever evolving and always nuanced design judgment, which I'm calling our comprehensive comprehensions. There are a few hints that Dante understood aspects of comprehensive comprehension. For example, in Inferno 11, quote, "It pleases me no less to question than to know." And we see that Dante understood the importance of questions. Dante also sometimes sees the value of ignorance. For example, on the terrace of avarice in Purgatorio 20, after the dramatic earthquake and loud shout from all sides, the narrator muses, "Never before, unless my memory errs, had my blind ignorance stirred up in me so violent a desire for the truth as I felt now, racking my brain to know." Dante even imagines our ignorance as a profoundly important principle for humility. This is from Paradiso 13. "No Mr. or Miss Know-it-all should think, when they see one man steal and one give alms, that they are seeing them through God's own eyes, for one may yet rise up, the other fall." In addition to never putting the value of questions and ignorance into anything like the form of our comprehensive comprehensions, Dante has several passages that attribute a negative valence to ignorance and asking the wrong question. These are antithetical to the curiosity and the value of psychological safety that I think is crucial for our comprehensivity. And now my final 10th epistemic virtue for comprehensive learning: collaborative comprehensive exploration. This is the aspiration to listen to and work with others by sharing our individually articulated experiences, perspectives, hypotheses, ideas, generalized principles, integrities, and comprehensive comprehensions, to collaboratively compose new comprehensive comprehensions, or perhaps their underlying components, the other 9 in our list, right? So that, which we might not have imagined independently if we weren't working collaboratively. Except in the heaven of the sun, Paradiso, cantos 10 through 14, where 24 dancing scholars interact with the pilgrim, I get no sense that Dante understood the social design of comprehensive comprehensions. Through collaborative exploration, instead, I get the sense that in Dante's Comedìa, all wisdom comes from wise guides who in turn see reflected glimpses of divine light. Okay, to put it all together, we have seen that in Dante's Comedìa, It has many of the epistemic virtues that this list of 10 I'm sharing on the screen, but not all of them. Mystique, forming a whole, meaning making, these he doesn't clearly have. The extent to which Dante's text embraces comprehensive practice shows that it is a very important work in the history of the tradition of comprehensive inquiry and action, despite any shortcomings. So Shrikant, that was an awful lot. I think we should gather questions. I have one question for everyone, but maybe we should gather everyone's questions first.
Yes, let's do that. Okay, I think there is an echo that I'm getting. I'm going to mute. Okay, all right. So whenever you want to speak, just unmute. Otherwise, I'm getting an echo from your line. Okay. I have one suggestion, CJ. This is a lot that you put on the table, and we have a very unusual opportunity here, because many of the names that I'm seeing, many of the faces that I'm seeing have participated actively in the Dante meetups. So they will have a good idea. So how about asking an open-ended question of saying in which of these 10 virtues they see Dante as being strong, and which that they see as weak. So maybe we can get a much more kind of a comprehensive discussion going, and then we will take specific questions. Does that work for you? You need to unmute.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fine. Although, if people have questions, let's take them too.
Sure. All right, folks. So first question, let's go ahead and talk about which ones do you think, where do you think Dante is strong, and where do you think he's weak? That's an open-ended question, but you can raise any other question or talk about this. Okay, type exclamation mark if you would like to talk or if you would like to ask questions. David.
Right. I wanted to start with a question, because I'm not sure I understand mystique. Mistakes, when you make them, you learn from them. That's a positive value. But intentionally making mistakes, that can't be mystique. So what is the difference between intending to learn from your mistakes and this? This is obviously a different value. So please help me there.
Yeah, I think I should take this right away. For me, mystique is the recognition that there's always a gap. No matter how polished your theory, Einstein's E equals MC squared, there's got to be some gap. And if we recognize that there's always a gap, and that we can never express the truth 100% crystal, like in God's words, you and I, we just can't speak through God's words. If there is a God, I mean, even if there isn't, we don't know the laws of the universe. So there's always a gap. Mystique is the transformation from being stymied or embarrassed by these mistakes to accepting that there's always a gap. That gap, when you interrogate, when you notice the gap and start asking questions about it and start exploring it, that's where you can learn more. And so it's this heightened awareness that in the gap, in the mistake, is where the Stuart Firestein says that the most important thing for a laboratory researcher in science is when the experiment fails. When it fails, well, either our technique wasn't good enough and we need to learn how to, move the vials and the chemicals better, or we've got a discovery. We've got a fish on the hook, a cosmic fish on the hook. So mistake mystique is this recognition that all of our learning comes originally from mistakes, identifying the mistake, seeing the gap, fleshing it out with hypotheses, alternative perspectives, trying to build what I'm calling comprehensive comprehensions. Although some people limit themselves to just generalized principles. They say, oh, I got a generalized principle, E equals MC squared, I'm done. Put it in the textbook, make people cite it like a catechism, and don't look for the gap. The theory of comprehensive learning I'm proposing, we acknowledge mistakes as a key to the whole process.
Thank you. Next up is Joe.
Yes, thank you, CJ. So I'm going to try to address the question that was posed with, what are Dante's strengths and weaknesses within these 10? With adequate breadth, I actually think that it's both a strength and a weakness, in that he goes very deep into a wide range of traditions. He goes from, the Greeks to Islamic. He includes an entire history of humanity and basically literature. But at the same time, I feel like it's a weakness because he passes judgment on many of those same people and saying what they did wrong and did not do right. So I think that there's that is a weakness and a strength at the same time, where he actually includes everybody, but he also ranks them and categorizes them in ways that are not just. The second part that I think is where there's a lot of strength is generalized principles. I think that one's an obvious one, in the sense that the way even everything, hell, purgatory, and heaven are even structured. They're structured based on essentially generalized principles. Whether it be the theological virtues, whether it be the cardinal virtues, these are principles that are generalized, that are basically covers throughout the Comedìa. And I'm trying to figure out how to incorporate some others, but those will be the first two. I have a couple more, but I just need to figure out how to maybe incorporate love into these, because I think the way Dante approaches the subject of love is really unique, and it's something that actually fits into this conversation. I just need to figure out exactly how. Maybe it falls under the idea of multiple working hypotheses, because there's so many different forms of love. The idea of the object of love, or the idea of excessive love, and how these things are actually how we pervert love, and how the love in heaven is actually different than the love in earth, in the sense that it's unconditional, where everybody else loves, and it's absent of things like envy, where you're actually happy for other people that you are caring for. And this Virgil goes through this in Purgatory very clearly, where he talks about the limits of human love and the difference between human love and God's love. So it is like a multiple working hypothesis in a way. So those are just some initial thoughts. I mean, I guess I could have gone into a little bit more detail, but I'll stop
Thank
there.
you. Thank you, Joe. That was great. Next up is Phil.
Yeah, I just have two questions about two of the two virtues. Maybe CJ can elaborate a little bit more. So I also have a question about, just like David, about the mistake mystique. It seems there are two concepts there that are put together. One is this idea of intellectual limitations, gaps in our knowledge, and things like that. But there's another concept, and I'm not sure if it belongs necessarily there, which is the concept of ethical shortcomings, right? Which is a completely separate thing. Now, to Dante, of course, I think he does acknowledge our limitations many times in Paradiso, especially as we get closer and closer to the incomprehensible. He's very much, he's very verbal about that. But he's not as tolerant in terms of our human moral shortcomings. And I think CJ mentions that in the paragraph on the mistake mystique. So I'm just curious, is that intentional to combine those two things? It seems to me that they might be separate. And then the other one is just on virtue number 9, the comprehensive comprehension. I'm wondering if maybe CJ can explain a little bit more, because I'm not sure I get the essence of that. Is that just the idea that you end up with a set of new questions based on the knowledge you already have? Is that the essence of it, or am I missing it? Anyway,
Yeah.
those are
Great. Thanks, Phil. The gap, you understand the gaps with mistake mystique. The real question is ethics. And yeah, that's a tough one. Part of me believes that in order for us to really grow as people, being moralized, like, you deserve to be in hell. I can't think, that's moralizing. It's just not conducive for people to learn from their mistakes. Yeah. But Buckminster Fuller has a scenario where he talks about, if I had all the life experiences of that bad guy, I'm sure I'd have done everything they did. This idea that a lot, for example, in Dante's world, we have a lot of blood feuds and whatnot. This is applying a very strident morality to, someone assassinated my brother-in-law, so now I've got to assassinate. This is bad. I mean, we need mistake. I mean, my feeling is we need mistake mystique, and that a lot of this moralizing and ethical berating each other is really the wrong way to go. That even if we don't like murder and we don't like genocide, and so we want to do something about that. Yes, we do. We should. But is writing a poem to put them all in hell the right way to do it? I wouldn't do that. Dante did, and it's a great poem. But from my perspective, it comes up short as how to learn from each other. If how to learn from each other is important, then we have to learn from Hitler. We have to learn from the bad people. And just throwing them in hell or prison or executing them, we don't learn what created that monster. And so I think I'm standing by my theory and saying Dante went off the rails a bit there. Now your second, I'm sorry.
No, I just wanted to make sure you got to the second question. Great.
The second question is very important. Comprehensive comprehension. So the idea I've been developing in a few events, and if you read the essay, I actually link in the section on comprehensive comprehension to the previous events. You could watch the video or read the essay, but I'll save you the time and trouble. The idea is that we have multiple hypotheses, we have multiple perspectives, and we're trying to integrate them. We're trying to make meaning out of them. We're trying to form generalized principles. We're forging them into integrities, trying to make it all interaccommodative, make it work. And what I'm suggesting with number 9 is that the way you do that is with questions. That questions cohere your multiple hypotheses, questions cohere your multiple perspectives. We might not be able to judge which hypothesis is, the way God actually designed the universe. We hope we can, but maybe we disagree with each other. You might have a strong opinion one way, and I have a strong opinion the other. So my proposal in comprehensive learning is that we take these two hypotheses that are in competition and we search them for the gaps. We search them for how might we think about it where one hypothesis is right and the other is wrong? How might we think about it where both are right, where both are wrong? What are the fabric of questions we can use to cohere these multiple hypotheses so that we can maybe do some experiments or do some further research or talk to more people or consult another tradition. And we start building this fabric where instead of, in my ignorant youth, I thought that the way you learned was you got a book and oh, wow, this book has the truth. Now let me go to my bookshelf, get the cauldron now and throw all the old books that had inferior knowledge into the fire. I've got the truth. But now my new idea with comprehensive comprehension is no, even the wrong idea from that wrong book is important in cohering our knowledge. One of the ways I learned this was I took a physics class, elementary mechanics. And in this elementary mechanics class, I was coming from this, truth-oriented math perspective. And I was why are these physicists talking about these outdated theories? I've read popular book on science after popular book on science that says Einstein replaces all this stuff. Why do I have to learn about Newton's laws? Well, physics actually cares about good approximations. It's not what popular books say modern science is about, but it's what they teach at MIT, their students, even though they're just crude approximations, because part of being an expert in physics is knowing how to make a crude approximation with an incorrect theory that comes damn close most of the time. So what I realized with this is that the way we advance our learning is not by getting higher and higher generalized principles and throwing out Newton and throwing out Aristotle. we keep adding new ideas to Aristotle and Newton, and we cohere the older approximations that still might be really good intuitive aids, and to really form a thorough understanding, you cohere with questions and alternative hypotheses and all the experimental evidence and all the, it works well in this case and not well. You put that all together into a comprehensive comprehension, and what you get out is not the truth. You get out judgment. You get out, now I can really negotiate in a new situation that no one's ever been in before. I can pull out, well, maybe this is a good time for a Newtonian estimate. Maybe this is a good time for Einstein, who knows? I hope that helped.
Thank you. Thank you, CJ. Next up is going to be Meg, Doug, and David. Meg, go ahead.
Okay, this is my first meeting, so I hope I'm
Welcome.
don't embarrass myself. I love Dante so much, so this is so cool. I've seen all the Yale classes and read it a couple times, but I think like what you were saying, CJ, about and what I was reading about like the value of reading it. It's it really pointed out things that I hadn't even thought of before. And just personally, I think Dante has his weaknesses are because of his pride, and he's kind of one-sided and not very open to other perspectives, I would say. But yeah, I've always been impressed by just the breadth and the depth of how much is in there, just packed in there. But since I'm new, this is just a really short question, but have you applied these 10 virtues to other works of literature, or is this something you came up with especially for just this reading the Divine Comedy?
So thank you for joining us, and thank you for your comment and your question. When Shrikant and I started organizing this series on Comprehensivist Wednesdays in July 2020, I started laying out a vision I had formed about comprehensive learning. And as I developed it, after 3 or 4 or 5 months, I said, I keep thinking that comprehensivism is new. But 9 years ago, I read Dante. And everything I remember about Dante is that he was comprehensive. So maybe comprehensivism isn't new. And I said, you know what I got to do? I got to reread Dante to find out what he says about comprehensivism. So that's what led Shrikant to bring Phil into our group and organize a bunch of events. Our final event is December 5th. And so I really took this year of rereading Dante to discover how much his comprehensivism matched the theory of comprehensivism I had been developing through the Comprehensivist Wednesdays events. And tonight's event is my attempt to share what I learned in that process.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, CJ. That was an excellent overview. I too, was completely floored by the comprehensivity of Dante, of just the sheer breadth. I mean, there are very few people in history who have done that, of somebody who just takes in every piece of knowledge, philosophy, literature, religion, politics, everything, and then prepares a really moving, powerful, literature, builds literature on that. So just, I was blown away by that. And I think it was a perfect choice. And I was delighted that Phil and Doug did such a magnificent job of leading us through Dante's work. Next up is Doug.
Yeah, I found the mistake mystique, CJ's discussion of it and the gaps really interesting. I found it in a way the most fertile area to explore, because it's like the question of whether Dante has any mystique or fascination with mistakes is really important. And he may not, or he may actually have them, but his pride doesn't allow him to actually worship mistakes, And I think to understand the mistake mystique, you have to go to Bucky's idea of the child as a born genius and a natural engineer from the first time he starts to experiment with gravity. How does he stand up without falling down? How does he get off a bed smoothly? And Bucky would imitate that. He'd teeter on the edge of a table with his ass to the audience and sort of show how a child would get off of a bed and balance and sometimes fall and boom on the floor and make a mistake until, how you reach for your mother's finger and the hand misses it, and there are mistakes, a lot of them in Purgatory and in Inferno. And there's a lot of curiosity from Dante about the Ghibelline, Farinata, who was mistaken, but also very wise. So there is some, but you're absolutely right, CJ. By the time the paradise gets there, and I got very frustrated with this because it's no longer an experiential journey. It's like all this revealed knowledge that keeps getting handed to him on a platter. And sometimes they smile at him, sometimes they get impatient with him, but it's not as playful as when Virgil laughs at him for being too sympathetic with somebody and then slaps him down for being too sympathetic for somebody, and then suddenly Virgil goes, I'm afraid a lot of the comedy in Dante is like Punch and Judy comedy. It's like where he kicks an evil guy in the head. I think that was funny to the medieval sensibility. I think it's like vaudeville that's brutal and very comic. And I do think in the ancient literature, before and after Dante, there's a lot of mistakes. If you look at the tragedies, and the oracles are always given mistaken interpretations, and people make big mistakes in their lives because they believe an oracle in a certain way. And the tragic poets knew that. And the comedies, Plautus, his sort of the mistakes lovers make, or fathers thinking they can trust their daughters, or fathers thinking they can't trust their daughters, or all the mistakes in comedy. And in Hamlet is one trial and error experiment after another, and thought experiments about, did he kill my father? Is the king my uncle? Did he kill the true king, my father? And how does he inherit that? And how does he purge the land? Then he figures it out, much like Oedipus cures the plague by finding the killer. And he's relentless. Everybody tries to throw him off the path, from Tiresias the prophet to his mother. They try to shove him away from the truth, and Oedipus pursues the truth right to the end. So that aspect of Greek thinking that is later integrated in the Renaissance, I think Dante has a real blind spot to that. And it really helps me, CJ, that you pointed that out. There's something missing there. A playfulness around mistakes is just not, except in the meanest ways, maybe. That's sort of all I really wanted to say. But there's one other thing, Dante does realize, though, there are children who make certain mistakes. He says they lisp and they love their mother. And then they learn to speak more precisely, and they wish their mother was dead and buried. It's a brutal little 2 lines there he has, where the lisping child loves the mother, and when they get old enough to talk and fall in love and realize what money's about, they just see their mother as an obstacle. So I think there is, I don't know how it plays in the Italian, I'm curious. That's a question I have. Ibsen we think of as a serious playwright because of the way he's translated into English. But I had a teacher who said he's very poetic in the original Norwegian and he's very funny in the original Norwegian, and that's mostly lost in translations. So I'm curious if there is more humor in the original Italian than what we get in most English translations.
And there may be a way to interpret Dante more generously than I have. You know, I've only read it twice. This is a poem you probably have to read 10 times. You know, but on my second reading, this is the feeling I got. And maybe some creative person can show me how to interpret. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I had one quick thing to say on that, and I meant to add this. I think Dante's mistakes and the mistake mystique is in fulfilling his job as a poet. Do I have the right words? Have I found the right words to express the beauty I've seen, or the terror I've seen, or the truths that I've seen? That's where his mistakes happen. Or he pretends to make mistakes and then he knocks it out of the ballpark like Babe Ruth, maybe. But it's sort of...
Thank you. I just want to say one term that Doug, you used about the medieval sensibility, I think is a very fundamental term, because this was different time and the way people thought was very different. So there is, and we are operating on modern sensibility, and you kind of have to make allowances for that and, you know, talk about it. So if anybody wants to talk about the sensibility of Dante and how it is different from modern, that's another kind of a topic. Next up is going to be David, followed by Laura. David.
Yeah, I'm sticking with this topic that we're on right now because I think it's a very, it's a multifaceted question. And I think it may go back to what Phil was saying about ethical shortcomings and the question of what is moralizing, or is moralizing going on here? Because this seems like a big moralizing book on the face of it. But I think we need to look at Dante's point of view, like you're saying, and think about what it meant authentically to him as he was writing it, because he's not in the position of God making the judgment, but he's talking about his understanding. And there's some areas where the mistake mystique, which is about comprehension and learning, maybe more intellectual, may not apply, which is in a certain category of morals, which is action. Because once you act, it's forever. Too late to learn. You hurt that person. You rode over that animal. Whatever you did, there's something about reality that is different from knowledge, right? Which is the nature of time is to move forward only. As Doug said, tragic as it is, the thing about time is that it may not be like our learning about other things. One act is forever. There's a reality to it. So this is unforgiving. This is the nature of the universe he's examining. How can one live in that universe? It's judged the moment you do it. So let's put ourselves in a different look at that. The universe is judging every act you're doing. From Dante's point of view, nature, God, reality is meting out the balance, the justice, and the results from what you're doing, and he's giving you a system for that. The question how mistakes fit into that is interesting, because these are indelible marks you're making on the paper as it goes, by. Okay, we talk of it equivalently. I mean, we talk about karma, or say there are consequences. Everything has ripples, and there are unknowns of everything we do. There are the infinite unforeseens. But we also point to individuals who do things wrong, and we talk about that. What is that happened there? That's a symbol of something, of value, not the full person. When I talk about Jerry Sandusky and the, criminality, treating his students, athletic students, or I talk about Trump or anyone, and we examine a particular kind of flaw. It's the moment of flaw, not their whole lives, that we're really talking about. So that's like kind of the moral language of what we're examining in the indelible universe of real action. So that's the moral universe, I think, that we have to confront as his concern here. So it has that's a certain thing to deal with. So I think he deals with it in a certain way, this way. His own sense of pride is his own, he knows his own failure. Every time he sees pride, he's haunted by thinking, oh, I'm going to end up here. I mean, this is like this, I'm worse than these guys. But he learns maybe from their mistakes, because he's going to get to go back and carry it. So he's learning from all of the worst things. Every worst thing he sees, which is indelibly historically past, is now his what do you call it? His college of learning. He's going to find every mistake and get the most out of it, and write poetry about it and pray for them if it's possible. So it's a study of mistakes, the whole thing. And the ones that are almost forgivable are in purgatorio, where they're still working it out, So he sees the study of mistakes as necessary in order to reach the highest plane. So he may not be stating this as the virtue, but he's doing it all the way through the work in a certain way. So he sees the gap in all the behaviors, and he's wondering, how do I direct myself? Is it by reason? And that takes him so far. And how do I direct myself? Is it by love? So he's looking for, I guess, the knowledge or the change of self, the soul, that can come out of examining all the mistakes, whichever way is the right way to examine those mistakes. So that's where I see him not totally falling out of this number 6 value. And then I'd say, okay, so for the comprehensive 10, let's add an 11th. Maybe all of comprehensibility has to have a higher goal. What's the goal? We should all be directed to the highest values. Maybe that's what integrity means. I'm not sure. So it's already in there. But in service of the highest human good, which Dante's words would be divine.
Thank you, David. I like that. There is some sense in which you're right. Hell is mystique. It didn't work for me. But I mean, it just so.
DJ, maybe it's getting over the hurdle of God language, which we don't use. This is translated from the time of God language, where that's the way you spoke and you framed things, and it's the Newtonian world, and we don't think that way anymore. But you know what? It's a whole language. It's not a rejection of modern science. It's just a way of talking about when things happen. What does it mean? Where's it directed to? And that there's a certain grace in the world, that we're given a place we can live. That's, everything does have a theme here. That's all. It's a language.
Yeah, I mean, one of the observations that people have made is that in Aristotle's causes, in the modern world, everything is interpreted as efficient cause and material cause. And final cause is not really looked at, and formal cause is not really looked at, whereas Dante is full of final causes. Next up is going to be Laura, Ambika, and Joe. Laura.
Okay, well, this is not huge, but moral code. I don't know if it's true, but I think the Italians have had a long-standing moral code, which is very different than our moral code. So you have to be careful when you're thinking about and interpreting it, because it just is very different. And I think that one has to appreciate that it's a lot looser than ours. I mean, men have affairs with women and stay married to their wives forever. Their wives turn their heads and know that their husbands are having affairs for a lifetime. But it's the way it is, as they say, e così. And they live happily forever after for many years, 60 years, whatever. So that's the truth. And I think we Americans with our puritanical codes can't really accept the moral code that they lived by. And I think, we have to say, no, that's not very good. So be careful when you're reading and interpreting the moral code of Dante, not to impose our moral code onto it, because theirs is far more liberal than ours ever was. And I know for a fact it still exists today. So in all its glory. So just a point of reference.
Yeah.
I'll be your
No,
Italian.
that-
I'm going to be your Italian translator in terms of words and culture. And if you need help pronouncing his last name, just come to me anytime, and I'll give you the pronunciation.
Laura, go ahead and pronounce the last name. I think that it will be useful to everybody.
Okay. His last name is Aligheri.
Thank you, Laura.
Laura, thank you. I appreciate that. And one of the objectives of comprehensive learning is to learn and embrace those other cultures. But in order to do that, we need to integrate in our discussion, in our comprehensive learning, these conflicting cultures. And my list of epistemic virtues is my proposal for the way I see that we can value those who disagree with each other and maybe with us, and put them in. And the way I think we do that is with mystique, with sort of comically looking at ourselves and saying, you know, my whole life might be a mistake. And as long as you think your whole life might be a mistake, you know, let's talk about it and see how we can navigate, negotiate a deeper understanding of each other. If you adopt the values of, well, many values that suppress or limit the looking at mistakes, I think you can't explore as far. That's just, it's a work in progress, but that's what I'm trying to get at.
Thank you, CJ. Next up is Ambika, Joe, and Elena. Ambika.
So this is really fascinating to me, and my mind's just been kind of circling and taking all this in, and I'm not sure exactly where to begin now. So I'm going back to your mystique. I like the title you have. When is a mistake an error or a failure? And we have a right to fail. And, you know, what may be a mistake to you may not be a mistake to me or to someone else. So when is a single mistake a mistake for everybody? You know, certainly when you're destroying the whole culture and all of that, that's certainly fits in like, not just a mistake. It's a distortion of love. It's everything you shouldn't do to destroy your people. But sometimes a little mistake is joyful. So where and how do you allow for that? And some mistakes and errors become discoveries and a eureka. There's something new emerges from it. And then, of course, we have the tragic hero. And when that wasn't enough, we have the landscape that ends up being the protagonist, the tragic protagonist, or something else. So we also create these, not discord, but ranges of characteristics and attributes, either in people or in places, that may work to your advantage or not. And if it's not working to your advantage, is it a mistake in some way or the other? Because it's still going to lead to something. And so that was what my mind was playing with. And yes, there is always room to write a poem about anything and everything. And in all these epic journeys, characters make mistakes. You're asked to turn left, but you're a little bit late. The light has turned. So you go right because the light is shining in that direction. So there are all these wonderful dances of elements and light and dark and stars and astrology, astronomy, everything working together in accord and discord with our journeys. And that's so fascinating. And so when does it become morality or immorality? When we are deliberately doing something to harm somebody, I think, not when it's just, you stepped over a rock and you fell, and there you discovered a golden key and a well. I didn't mean to make that rhyme, but it did. Oh, and I think, and this is reflecting back, CJ, on something you said just about 20 minutes ago. Don't remember what that was, but what if we start to look at parenting patterns and the lineage, to see where we may not be doing something that should cohere with our individual uniqueness going forward, where we can prevent and avoid possibly certain complications in individual lives and journeys. I don't know if any of this makes sense, but.
Thank you. It's a good thinking it through.
Thank you, Ambika. Next up is going to be Joe, followed by Elena. Joe.
So I'm going to try and maybe talk a little bit about this mistake being a point in time and something that can't be overcome. But in the Mazzotto videos, he talked about the idea of hope is something that can transform a mistake into something different, where you saw it as no longer being a mistake per se, but it is something that actually led you to something better. So you can transform. It's like it's independent of time, in the sense that, I don't know. I forget exactly how he put it, but essentially you're hoping for something better, so you no longer see something as a mistake. And how does the idea of reconciliation even fit into that kind of to this equation as well? The idea that you can be forgiven for this mistake, and that this mistake may actually end up being something as a blessing. I don't know. I mean, it's just a thought.
Thank you, Joe. I want to say one thing. I mean, I think mystique is very much of a modern idea. The medieval world is trying to preserve what was there, and most of the focus is to kind of focus on what is there and trying to hold on to it. Whereas the modern world, our capacity, even in action, the cost of making a mistake in the modern world relative to what we have is relatively small. So you can go ahead and not only make a mistake in your head, you can make a mistake in your action and recover from it because of our prosperity and all. So I think it's very much, the entire science is based on that, entire technology is based on that. And that was not the case, I mean, with the Middle Ages. So that's, just observation I had.
Yeah. So I think you're right, Shrikant. As I was researching this essay, as I wrote my essay, I did some research, and I found there's a professor at the University of Washington. I think his name is Bill Talbot. And he just wrote a book about mistake making in epistemology. He's a philosopher. And he's got on his webpage a link to a YouTube video where he gave an 1.5-hour presentation. So here I am trying to write my essay, and I'm like, okay, I'll watch this video. And he argues that Western philosophy has fundamental problems with its epistemology because it doesn't admit mistakes. And he finally, in 2021, writes the first book on epistemology that introduces mistake making to Western epistemology. This is what he argues. And so I sent him an email, and he wrote me back and he said, I think that mistake making entered the consciousness of Western philosophy with, oh my God, I'm going to blank on his name. The famous philosopher who falsifiability, Popper. No. Is Pop? No. Who's falsifiability? Popper. And so he claims that mistake making entered modern philosophy through Popper and falsifiability early last century. Now, he hasn't, we need to consult poets and read some more literature. I mean, I'm not convinced that's the last word, but at this point, that's my best hypothesis from a professor at University of Washington.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Elena and Phil, and then we will go to the second section. Elena.
Yes, and first, I'm just glad that everyone started to speak, because of the very beginning was serious to say. Now we're just, I'm glad we're exchanging ideas and we're making it lighter. So what I want to bring up is that it's our interpretation. What we call mistakes, say if it's an entirely different world where everything was upside down, and let's imagine that, it could be that our mistakes would not be mistakes. Though, again, it's one of the hypotheses. Though in this particular instance, just bringing up Divine Comedy, it was born because of Dante Aligheri fell in love with a little girl who was 9 years old, and then she grew up and she died at the age of 24, while Dante was married to his wife and had already children with her. So it's that's why it's like looking for love and loving someone who's and never ever going to be in reality next to him. So that was one of the inspirations for the comedy. And then the rest of Dante's life, when he aligned with wrong political group and was pretty much had to spend the rest of his life in exile. That was another moment of why all this comedy was born. It was born out of the suffering and pain and just going through the circles of hell. So he just experienced that, and that's why he created a piece of just unbelievable beauty, because of he had to feel it. And if not for mistakes, if not for love for Beatrice and everything else, the exile and suffering, he would not be able to describe this in this heavenly way. So that's why I'm saying, like, what is mistake, and who judges the mistakes? So that's what it's an interesting conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I think, as I've said, I think mystique for me, for comprehensive learning, is this open mystique, this heightened awareness that by finding the gaps in our understanding, in our communication, in our behavior, in our designs, by really looking for and wallowing in these gaps, these places where in hindsight we came up short, either in communication, in action, in understanding, in our design work. And that by really navigating and negotiating these gaps through a heightened awareness of their importance, we can learn more, and we can improve our judgment and our, it's this sense that that's a crucial idea. And okay.
Thank you. We'll go to Phil, Doug, and then we'll go to the second section. Phil.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. It's so interesting how this discussion has really centered on this aspect of mistakes and the role they play in comprehensive learning. For my part, I just want to thank CJ for pointing out another aspect of this, which is this idea that any knowledge involves transgression, which I think you're quoting one of the lectures of Mazzotto. But that concept, I think, also runs very deeply throughout the Commedia, with a character like Ulysses, who represents this human impetus to learn and to make mistakes and to challenge the boundaries. And of course, it's notable that he ends up in hell and his endeavor fails. And Dante uses him as an object lesson in this sort of humanism, I guess you would call it, which is the idea that, you know, there are no boundaries, that human knowledge is limitless and we should just pursue it, and so forth. And I agree with Shrikant to a degree that modern world is very much more hopeful, more optimistic about this endeavor than the medieval mind was. But I think we shouldn't forget that we go through these cycles of hope, you know, the boom and bust, not just for business cycle, but also for knowledge cycle, I would say. And there are terrible tragedies that sometimes when we get over optimistic about learning and pushing the boundaries, we forget that terrible mistakes can be made, sometimes irreversible mistakes. I think Doug and I were going back and forth on Dermot's play, The Physicists, and of course there, this idea that knowledge is just something objective and it doesn't really touch the real world is challenged in a big way. Of course, not the first time. Oedipus is another great way to challenge, another great look into this idea of knowing and prioritizing knowledge over everything else and the tragedy that ensues from that. But The Physicist is more modern in the sense that this is dealing with, you know, things that are very much close to our experience, the atomic bomb, the idea that, you know, physics is not just abstract exploration of matter and energy. It's actually something that can destroy us. And this idea of transgression and the whole biblical story of the fall that's tied up with the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And this idea that knowledge can actually kill you. And being comprehensivist, I think, would entail heeding that to some degree, at least, while you're on that journey to know more, but keeping in the back pocket this idea that it is with great power comes great responsibility, to paraphrase Spider-Man. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Transgression is important. The way I try to deal with that in my list of epistemic virtues is with adequate whole, adequate depth, adequate breadth. This notion of the adequate, which is also discussed in the Design Way, which is one of the projects 52 Living Ideas is working on, I think is very important. And I in my essay and in my presentation earlier, I don't know if you caught it, you know, it goes by so quick, but I really felt when I was writing the essay that the issue of transgression is the way in which Dante sort of navigates adequacy in my language, in the Design Ways language. And it was an insight I had that this whole major theme, Phil, you're absolutely correct that this is a major theme in Dante, is where in modern terms we might think the notion of adequacy is negotiated. I haven't thought that through fully, but I got a glimpse of it and included it in my essay, and I thought that was, so I appreciate the opportunity to add that. You're right, Shrikant, we need to get on to part 2.
Sure. Let me make one comment, and then I will have Doug, say something, and then we'll go. Just 2 minutes. So what I want to say is that we have said many things about the limitations of Dante, about mistakes, but I want to point out that Dante has things which are actually more than the list that we talked about. And on those things, he's actually much greater than moderns. For example, his focus on final causes of saying, what are we after? What really means? What is really meaning of life? What is it? What is this entire experience about? So final causes, also formal causes. What is the nature of human being? The inquiry into that somebody like Dante has is far deeper than most modern writers. So I want to give kudos to Dante for that, because as we criticize him for things that he doesn't have, that moderns have, we also have to respect the things that he has that moderns don't have. Next up is Doug, and then we'll go ahead to the second section. Doug, you need to unmute.
I'll keep this short because I typed it up and I'll put it in the chat, but I wanted to bookmark it because it connects to the mystique and the idea of the hero and the tragic flaw, which comes from the word hamartia. And hamartia, I talked to a classic scholar that said that's a form of ambition that actually helps the city and destroys the hero, and that it was a necessary value. So Aristotle in the Poetics seemed to have understood, or the classic tragic poets maybe understood it better than Aristotle. And Butcher, the introduction to the Poetics, Francis Ferguson, he's really brilliant on theater and on Oedipus and the classics. And he was actually, Francis Ferguson was a friend of J. Robert Oppenheimer's. They were college buddies. And he's really brilliant on action and theater, and that Oedipus's purpose is really to cure the plague. And he does that by finding the murderer, and it's him. And he sacrifices himself for the good of the city. And that's, it's important that we do misunderstand the classics. So I think the tragic flaw may be an interesting thing to fold into mystique, CJ.
Tragic flaw.
And the moralization of that into something that it didn't originally mean. That it's a sin or it's a mistake, and we're seeing him punished because he did something bad. Well, no, he did something good and it destroyed him.
Wonderful.
Very different.
I like that. That's good. And I'm also curious, in Chinese and Indian culture, maybe there's more mystique than in European, Roman. Maybe the Greeks had it, but the Romans didn't. I mean, there's wonderful questions that a scholar of history, much more than me, might be able to do something with.
Wonderful. Shall we go to the second section?
Yeah. So I'm going to leave you all with one final question on our first part on the epistemic virtues. I'll just leave it out there. If anyone has an answer, message me, put it in the chat, post it as a comment to the blog, my essay. What, if anything, in Dante's Comedìa, in your mind, shows affinity for our comprehensivity, for our facility for comprehensive exploration? That's sort of what I was trying to fish for in the first segment. Now, in the second segment, I want to talk about the value of the Comedìa for our comprehensive practice. Reading the Comedìa with its riddles, metaphors, allusions, these require a broad understanding of literature, 2,000 years worth, and the history and culture of medieval Florence. And through these riddles, metaphors, allusions, reading that poetry with all of its historical references and references to literature, for one's it gives one a thorough workout for one's comprehensivity, for our facility for comprehensive inquiry and action, to better understand and participate in the world. What are some of the benefits of engaging the Comedìa as a tool for comprehensive learning? I'm just going to give a bunch of my reflections, and then we'll have an interactive discussion about them and your suggestions. First, I would say to better understand the sciences, philosophies, poetry, music, art, literature, politics, religion, and the many other cultural currents of the Middle Ages, we can get that from engaging the Comedìa as a tool for comprehensive learning. It can give those who are weak at reading poetry a sustained project to redress those deficiencies. 10 years ago, when I read the Comedìa for the first time, that was my main takeaway and benefit. For our comprehensive learning, the Comedìa can help us better understand how the poetic tradition developed in the Middle Ages in Europe. We can learn the poetry of the epic tradition, which documents both the famous and lesser known characters of history. And this epic tradition gives us some sense of the individual's role in world history. To essay the most comprehensive cosmic context of a human life as one poet saw it during the Middle Ages. We can learn the great difficulty of distinguishing what's in the commentaries that interpret literature for us from the original work itself. Do I accept what I read in my interpretation, or do I accept this commentator's assertions? Or both? Neither. Meaning both and neither simultaneously. I value the both neither. Another possibility is we can essay the role of justice, love, and desire in our lives and contrast our views with Dante's medieval views. We can get a mental workout thinking about the design of our lives in considering Dante's exploration of sins, virtues, vices, and principles of his wonderfully fictitious universe. We can become familiar with the Comedia's iconic images, scenes, and characters which are continually referenced in modern culture. And it can help us better understand the development of the modern world. I'll cite 3 examples. I learned in this reading that long before Descartes' introduction of the dualism of mind and body, Dante was obsessed with the importance of the body. Maybe Descartes didn't originate that idea. Secondly, I'm reminded that long before Christopher Columbus, Dante understood that the earth was spherical, contradicting the myth that Washington Irving introduced in his highly fictionalized biography of Columbus. And as I read it this time, I was reminded that in the medieval value system, sin means weight. Weight takes you in toward the center of the earth. And virtue or bliss is weightlessness. That's out toward the heavens. And so many scientists, including Carl Sagan, Martin Rees, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Stuart Firestein, and many others have falsely proclaimed that heliocentrism removed the earth from a privileged position. They are badly mistaken. On the contrary, heliocentrism places the ugly sin of the earth with Lucifer at its very center. This is the only privilege in medieval mind, is that the earth is the center of depravity, And heliocentrism places this depravity, the earth with its sin and Lucifer, into the purity of God's domain in heaven where there is no sin. Scientific thinking has been sullied by this mistake since 1686, when Fontenelle invented what Dennis R. Danielson dubs the Copernican cliché. And I'll end with one final benefit of engaging the Comedìa as a tool for comprehensive learning: to essay the history of comprehensive practice and learn about the values of comprehensivity, which are articulated in this 700-year-old work. We can look at the historical roots of comprehensivism. I did an event on comprehensivism in the Islamic Golden Age, the videos on YouTube. And that, combined with the translation movement of the 12th century, where Latin translations of Islamic works and come back into Europe, these all provided important context for Dante's fertile imagination. And Dante was able to leverage this broad cultural context to give us his outstanding exemplar of comprehensive imagination, which continues to inspire and sometimes exasperate its readers. So Shrikant, I want to do another gathering of questions, and I have a question if people need some prompting.
Okay, folks. So now what we are going to do is that we're going to gather questions. Okay, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Only questions at this point. We'll collect all the questions, and then everybody gets to answer all the questions. Everything is fair game at this point. Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to put a question on the table. You can do that, or you can raise your hand in Zoom, whatever you prefer. Laura, did you have a question?
No, I don't want to have to leave, but I just want to leave with one little tidbit more about Italian. Dave, I think, was talking about the mothers and Italian men. Okay, la mama is the most important thing in the world to the son. And mama never wants to give up her son, ever. And the wife is never as good as the mother. Mother can always do everything better. And if they have a big enough apartment and the son marries, they will cut off a piece of their apartment so the son can have an apartment right next door. And that force is so great. It exists always and forever and
thank you.
Ending. So whenever you read anything about the mother in any of this stuff, just understand that's the role of the mother in Italian life. Okay.
Thank you.
La mama.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you, Laura. Good night. All right, folks, questions. So first one up is Doug. Doug, what's your question?
I only have one question, and that's what's CJ's question he's been hinting at and sitting on since the beginning of the lecture almost 2 hours ago, because I may have to leave pretty close to the end point. What's your question that you've been wanting to ask us?
Oh, my question is, what value, if any, do you find in the Comedìa for your comprehensive practice?
Wonderful. Wonderful.
Oh, that's the one put into the chat. Great. Thank you.
Let's see. Meg, can you go ahead and speak out your question?
Yeah, that was my favorite question. I had a couple comments on it, but we can do it.
Okay. Yeah, excellent, excellent. So that's I would love to discuss that question, but any other questions? Go ahead and put. This is your last chance. Otherwise, we're going to discuss this great question. I think it's very appropriate. So let's start with that. Ambika, go ahead. Do you have a question? Go ahead.
Maybe discuss all the different mythical systems that are explored in the Dante's journey, and the motifs that remind us of our humanity, that are so, mutual connections and archetypes.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambika. So let's start with CJ's question. What value, if any, do you find in Comedìa for your comprehensive practice? Who would like to answer? Go ahead. Everybody is invited to answer. Go ahead and type exclamation mark if you would like to answer. Joe.
I mean, I think for me, there are a lot of different things that I could go with, but one is faith as a way of knowing. Is perhaps one of the more important ones that I take away from Dante, in the sense that not everything can be known empirically to us, and that essentially faith is something that, and I had brought this up in another meetup, is that it transforms the rational mind and allows us to achieve something greater. And that it's basically acknowledging the limitations of our own reasoning, of human reasoning, so that it allows us to act independently of our, based on God's will, not necessarily just our personal will. So it allows us to achieve potentially a higher virtue. That's important on a number of levels. I mean, in the sense that even if you're thinking outside, we've talked about the idea of judgment here during the design way as well, how there's a design form of judgment. Even if we're thinking outside of a purely rational way of thinking, a purely analytical way of thinking, a purely objective way of thinking about things, that sometimes that we step out and actually use more, a different form of way of looking at the world, less scientific. So maybe that's perhaps one. I mean, it's one of the great takeaways. I think the other one would be just how he dissected specifically envy, and the importance of that to me personally, because I thought that, and I don't want to go on too long, how essentially envy is the value of things, and that things like peace, love, and knowledge are not something that can be possessed, and that they're truly good. They're, as opposed to something that, like, if you're envying somebody else's what they have, I think that was a different way of looking at that. And I forget her name. I want to say her name was Sapia or something, and it was specifically in purgatory. So that actually was something that I would take away. Anyway, there's
Wonderful.
a couple.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Next up is Meg, Ambika, and Doug. Meg.
Yeah, I looked at all the list here, and I value it. I mean, it has so much value, this great bullet points of all of these. So I agree with all those. A couple of things that I could add to it are just like it's a work you can go back to again and again and learn more and more. So like the Robert Hollander and Jean Hollander, basically their footnotes could be a whole book in themselves. So I really enjoyed that aspect. And this is the first time I kind of dove into the different translations. So another one might be to become familiar with how different translations can kind of alter the meaning of the text. So if you even just take the first line of it and look at all the different translations, you could see the differences. So that was something that really struck me for the first time when I kind of read this. And then I really like the become familiar with the iconic images, scenes, and characters, because I don't know if you've covered this, but there's so much artwork that's been inspired by it, like with Gustave Doré, William Blake, and Rodin, and Dali. So I'm really struck by how the images and scenes, they kind of go throughout different cultures. So those are the things that I especially, and then of course the actual story and all the content.
Excellent. Great observations, Meg, especially about the artwork. We have not talked enough about it, but I think that's something really, really fundamental, because one great artwork in one domain spurs on art in all kinds of other domains. Next up is going to be Ambika, Doug, and David. Ambika, what value, if any, do you find in Comedìa for your comprehensive practice?
I don't know exactly how to shape that answer, but I was curious about the idea of adoration as inspiration and something that stirs you onward in your journey. I like what Joe said about faith. And so this point came up. And then about art, what makes me wonder is if we also connected with Blake's art. And then since some of it is about love, I would like to go to the Dante Aligheri artwork as well, since we're looking at interactions between different cultures. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambika. Next up is Doug, followed by David. Doug.
Yeah, I think I read it for his meditations, what I find most valuable on good and beauty and love and desire, and that art and nature are full of lures that grab our attention and maybe draw us into a false love that dies, but that might lead us to a true love that lasts longer. I mean, I think that's ultimately the meditations on that. But also as a poet, his meditations on faith, hope, and charity, or love, he'll have a chapter and then a chapter and then a chapter on each one, a canto, and then later he'll have a line and a line and a line about each one, or a few verses about each one. It's almost like a singer who's setting out a long theme and then combining all of them into a very short reprise. It's pretty remarkable. But that takes a while to dig out. I mean, I end up ending a canto and hating it. And then I go back and read it again and I go, wow, it kind of blows my mind what he's actually doing. And that has a lot to do with the metaphors that he draws from nature and the similes. I learned a lot from my parakeet in the paradise, because when these sudden bursts of energies were happening, sometimes I was watching him at other times in the day, suddenly flap his wings. And it was like just this burst of energy from a little animal. You know, that burst of energy, Dante actually writes about quite a bit in it, you know, with the way people fly. And I also think there is comedy. I do think there may be a comedy in the way Cato comes in, like Pantaloon or the old father, crashing the party, and everybody scatters like, oh, Dad's home. Oh, Dad, you're so great. We love you. I'm sorry. You know, I think there is comedy in that, in the context of that period. He's such a party pooper, Cato. I mean,
wonderful. Thank you, Doug. I like just great observations always. Next up is David, followed by Phil. David.
Hard to follow that act. Mine's much more just intellectual thinking.
You are at a disadvantage. You don't have a parakeet.
Yeah, I totally.
No, I have a guide. That's my parakeet.
Right. That's good. And he tells you everything you told him, so he can't be wrong. Well, the reading of Dante, as Doug sort of reminded me, is a reminder of appreciation for details, and how all the little inconsequential things are really worth remembering and maybe writing about and bringing into your consciousness of your experience as you're living. Because who would think that you're going to tell these stories about birds when you're describing processes in Paradiso? But it's full of bird stories. I mean, it's a way to exemplify things. It's a way to learn how to speak and think by bringing images to be able to call them up. So an appreciation for living detail, that's one thing. And the second is, I don't want to read about flaws and human personalities, but to study and learn about human flaw and sin and shortcoming the configurations of compound desires that people gave into, and how it was a wreck for them, and what the appropriate punishment, not so we learn the moral lesson of punishment, but to think about what does it reveal about life when these things happen. And he has some pretty complicated examples, as Joe was saying. There's not just envy, there's various kinds of envy. There's envy of reputation, of things, of qualities, all these kinds of things. So I think studying that is as a prelude to reflection, about our own desires and our own conflicted choices and our passions. We all have conflicts. We all have unperceived feelings that are causing things that we need to look at and review, the way he went through in detail, looking at, well, it's not just what it looks like on the surface, it's more. So I think that is a wonderful, I don't know that I would reread it because it is such a painstakingly complicated set of things to look at. But it was sort of a joy for that, and I do think of going back to it because there's so much. It's so dense in that way. And I really think that the lessons, if that's mystique for me, I don't have to only learn from my mistakes. I think I can just as well learn from the mistakes that are laid out. When they're laid out in front of me, say, oh, I don't even see that as a flaw, and then have to go through and say, oh, this is perceptive. This is an angle that I have to see in order to understand the human being. And finally, I guess that can lead to looking for why it does good for us to know about our passions and what it's like to be human as opposed to a purely intellectual animal, and what to do with these urges and passions, which is not, according to Dante, interesting hypothesis, it's not something, it's a purely logical question. It's not a question of reason. It's a question of love. So dealing with your own decisions and passions, it's not always an intellectual issue that's at stake. It's an issue of heart and being directed in some way, and that to me is part of our dealing with our own self-defeating features and failures, is to find a shining light for the end of the story and know that that's a way to look at life. Very dark at the beginning, very shiny at the end, and then you're dropped back on the earth to think about it. It's kind of cool.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Next up is Phil.
So I want to say a couple of things about this question about how Dante helps in comprehensivist practice. Now, I haven't heard much about the comprehensivist practice until today, to be honest, but I think some of the principles that CJ enumerated in his essay are quite helpful. And in fact, probably a lot of people are using them without necessarily being able to enunciate them clearly. But those are great summation of I like that 10 virtues of comprehensivist thinking. In fact, I'll probably post it somewhere for further reference for me. In terms of how Dante helps it along those points, I want to relate a short episode that stuck with me. When I was a student in high school, I remember our physics teacher had a presentation on how a four-dimensional creature would look in three-dimensional space. And I never forgot about it, even though it was over 25 some years ago. Anyway, and the idea is you see these disconnected points because it's a higher dimensional thing. And also we talked about how you can collapse things from 3 dimensions into 2 dimensions and from 2 dimensions into 1 dimension and so forth. All of that to say is that a lot of times our thinking is in these lower dimensions. We lack orthogonal concepts, perspectives, views, and our thinking is all along x-axis or y-axis. We don't even think about something orthogonal because we lack imagination. And to me, one of the greatest things that Dante has done for me personally is lift me from whatever dimensionality of my current thinking and perspective into a higher dimensional view of the world. I mean, we talked about the breadth, but this breadth, the reason it's so broad is because we have so many different axes to consider what he's thinking about. You know, we have the individual personal axis, right? Personal psychology, modulation of desire, and these mistakes and sins and so forth, doubts. That's, you know, one axis that we're very familiar with. But then he combines it with the communal aspect, right? The city of Florence and all the history that's involved in that. That's a completely different axis to think about, and how the individual interplays with that. Then we have the societal and religious aspects, right? We have the intellectual, deductive reasoning versus empirical versus Ulysses type inquiries. Then we have this whole other, completely separate from all of that, a poetical dimension, right? Because the whole thing is a poem, and it's artistic, and it's meant to inspire our imagination. The things that he sees they have not only intellectual quality, but they have aesthetic quality to them, amazing aesthetic quality, that the rhythm, the pictures, the similes, the beauty of the language. And it's interesting that Dante, and I think we talked about this in the very beginning, Dante did not choose a philosopher, he did not choose a scientist to lead him along. He chose two people, and neither one of them was a scientist. One of them was a famous poet, the classical poet Virgil, and another was Beatrice, his love, the love of his life. He didn't choose an Einstein, he didn't choose Albertus Magnus, he didn't choose, Ptolemy or Aristotle. Why? He didn't even choose Plato or Socrates. Socrates might have been a very interesting companion, but he did not choose him. And this idea that human experience is so much more than just intellectual and rational is a tremendous insight that something is lost, that got lost in modernity. And people have the science fatigue, is what I'm hearing. A lot of times people say, the science fatigue, because people trying to explain everything through the biological, through physics or whatever. And human beings are just not, we are higher dimensional creatures. We're not just in the dimensions of physical space and time. And Dante understood that, and he understood it in such an amazing way that helps us navigate the modern world. And the fact that he's so different is not a detriment. It's a huge plus, because it opens up a whole new planes and whole new spaces of thinking. And I'm giving away some of the things I want to share next time we meet. But I feel like it's such an important point, and some of the people here are not necessarily in our group. There's a saying that literature, true literature, gives us atmosphere from alien planets, and that is what we have. It is an atmosphere, a gulp of alien atmosphere that we don't experience very often today, and that is, to me, the most treasured aspect. I don't know if it fits within the comprehensivist ideal. I think it does in a lot of ways. That's what I wanted to say.
That was beautiful, Phil. I mean, answering the question for myself, and then I'm going to ask CJ the same question. It is actually very similar to what Phil is saying. The way I formulate it is how Doug put it. It's sensibility. What happens is that we are stuck in our sensibility, individual sensibility, our cultural sensibility. Dante, firstly, he is of his time, and he is so eloquent. He's able to make his own personality come alive. So you see how he actually thinks. And that is very, very deep. I get the same experience in our exploration of Tao Te Ching, or the Gospel of John, or the Bhagavad Gita. All those are doing the same thing, because what happens is they show us, as Phil was saying, they show us a way of being human that we have not thought of, that comes from out there, as from an alien planet, and you begin to see value in that. And this is especially true when you're looking at Chinese, for example, Chinese, Lao Tzu, or you're looking at, Bhagavad Gita. But It is equally true with the Bible. You look at the New Testament and you try to understand its sensibility, but you kind of have to live that. You kind of have to take it, not in terms of critiquing this point or that point. That does not matter. It really doesn't matter what they got wrong, because we are standing on their shoulders. Because we are standing on their shoulders, we see more. So I give a lot of leeway to great people like this about their mistakes. What I really admire is, what did they see back then that I don't see now, or that is harder for me? So I think that kind of expansion of sensibility is the thing that I get. And yes, that is actually goes to the heart of comprehensivism, because comprehensivism is all about fully grasping what you're capable of. And this is showing you something fundamental about what you're capable of that you had never thought of before. So that's what I get. CJ, what about you?
Well, that was basically my essay, was my list of comprehensive reflections. I don't, there's so much to say, but I don't have anything really cogent on that. I have some closing remarks, but do we want to ask if anyone else has some closing remarks, or are we getting...
I want to give an opportunity especially to Doug or Phil, and people who have gone through the entire Dante cycle, to see if they have any closing remarks. Doug? Yeah, go ahead. Nope. Okay, Phil.
Well, I just wanted to mention, CJ pointed out one of the virtues is general principles. In other words, generalizing, especially it's important when you have so much detail, right? You're trying to organize. And of course, one of the things that we've tried to do is to see these patterns and generalizations as we went through, an enormous amount of detail. To me, one of the most valuable generalizations that Dante makes is about the nature of right and wrong, as a function of misdirected love or desire. To me, that is one of the key points that he belabors in Inferno, in Purgatory, in Paradiso. Love is, like John Lennon said, all you need is love. But he expounds on that in a way that he says, look, we all have desires, and the answer is not to pretend like we do not. In fact, I think we mentioned about stars and this idea that the word for star and the word for desire, they're similar. And this whole idea of a journey to the stars is very much apropos, because we're talking about how do we modulate human desire without falling into error, without hurting ourselves and other people. And his answer is, you have to have this proper balance between first loving some ideal, in his case it's God, but have this ideal shining principle that is, first of all, in your life. And then secondly, you love other people and yourself in a way that doesn't displace the nature of a human being, which is to create, to be an artist. So you have this intricate balance between loving the right things and in the right proportion, right? So gluttony, for instance, is loving food more than you ought to, and that creates a problem. and we all know that it does in a very pragmatic way, but they looked at gluttony as a sin. And we today might look at obesity as a problem that results from overeating. I mean, I understand there are other reasons for it, but in the most simplistic way, or the fact that you might become a thief because you love things too much, or you're envious of what other people have, etc. So this idea, this insight about the nature of desire and the role it plays in right and wrong was one of the great general principles. The other one was, of course, this idea that as you look at something, you become a reflection of what you look at. And if you contemplate the divine, in some ways you're going to be like the divine. And of course, in Paradiso, that's everywhere, because everybody's reflecting everything. We're like mirrors. And the further you get to or the closer rather you get to the divine, the more you become a reflective mirror of that. Now, what would be interesting is to talk about it, whether this, to what degree this insight is correct. And I'm thinking of Clockwork Orange as the counterpoint to that, and other modern works that to some degree question that ideal. But in any case, it's an interesting thought, again, an interesting dimension to contemplate. Those are some of the general principles that are my takeaways from the entire sort of some of the synthesis, I guess, of the entire work. There are others, but I think these are the most important ones to me.
Wonderful, thank you, Doug. Do you want to say anything? Okay, no. So the point, David, you have...
No, I don't have anything to add. I think it was a great discussion.
Excellent.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you. Everything you said.
Thank you, Doug. David, do you had something?
I think Phil, brought up some of the same points that, the role of reason in life and the view of the world as this complex and beautiful, unified thing, which is inside out and outside in at the same time. And that our structures of thinking have to always be open to reflections of completely different sort, and listening to voices that are different, and as much music as to mathematics. You know what I mean? So it's the light from the divine and the darkness in the same universe. It's fantastic.
Thank you. I want to say one thing. I want to thank CJ for instigating this entire project, and I'm always amused that he watches everything, he comments on everything in detail, but he does not attend. He reads and spends enormous amount of time doing all of this. And so thank you so much for starting this. I think it has worked out really, really well. And really grateful to you for that, CJ. CJ, your closing comments.
Okay, I realized I needed to reread the Comedìa in order to write the essay that was behind tonight's presentation. And my closing remarks build on that. Shortly after beginning our project to encompass a tradition of comprehensive inquiry and action and share it with the 52 living ideas in Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society's communities, which began in July 2020, I realized that Dante's Comedìa is an exemplar for this so-called new tradition that we have been building for 1 1/4 years. Thanks to Doug Jacobs and Phil and Shrikant and all the participants, David and Joe and so on, we've now explored Dante in depth, though there is a final event on Dante on December 5th, and I'm planning to attend. Jeannie's going to attend. From the perspective of Dante's poem, we can assay the state of the art of comprehensive practice from the Middle Ages 700 years ago. What we learn is that a strong foundation was already laid for comprehensive thinking long before the Renaissance. Our comprehensivity, our inclination to broadly and deeply and integratively encompass the whole of human experience, is a newly identified but age-old tradition in the art of human inquiry and action. We build our comprehensivity by studying old texts, by studying Buckminster Fuller, by studying the design way, and by participating in, well, not just the Comprehensivist Wednesdays, but all 52 living ideas in Greater Philadelphia thinking society. Next month, I plan to explore 3 important ethical issues if I can fit them in a 2,500 word essay, much shorter, at least half the size of this one. Each of these 3 ethical issues will have a Bucky component, but there is no one piece of Bucky writing that you can read. Instead, you're going to have to wait for my essay, which I haven't even started yet. So maybe I should get to work. Thank you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you very much, CJ. Let me tell you about what's coming up. We are not going to have a meetup on the day before Thanksgiving. So that's one. The week after that, Marissa would be here, and she will be talking about the dangers of having just one story or one point of view or one solution. So it's a big theme that actually CJ has talked about in multiple times. So she's going to pick up on that. So that's what is coming up on 2 weeks from today. Tomorrow, we're going to go into the Gospel of John. Day after tomorrow is going to be Bhagavad Gita. On Saturday, I'm doing my own take on comprehensivism, where I try to put together different fields. That's going to be Saturday. I think it's at 4:30. On Sunday, we are looking at a thinker called Sri Aurobindo and his concept of integral yoga. It's a very deep concept of integrating inner and outer world and inner experience. And Nilesh is one of the top experts on Sri Aurobindo, and integral yoga. So I would definitely recommend that. And we're also going to be talking about the digital world and post-humanity. And that's going to be at 3 o'clock on Sunday. The integral yoga is going to be 10 a.m. because it has to match with the Indian time. You have to work with the Indian time. Nilesh is in India. So that's what is coming up. Look forward to seeing you folks on many of these. See you soon. Bye. And thanks, CJ.
Thank you, CJ.
Thank you.
Thank you, CJ, Phil, and Don.
Thanks, everyone.
And Shrikant.
Bye, everybody. Phil, great you could make it. I really wanted you to see this.
I'm glad I did. It was a great discussion.
All right. Take care. Bye.